Hello, I'm Erik Wait, and this is lesson 5 in our study of covenant theology. And in this lesson, we'll be looking at the Abrahamic Covenant. After the Noahic Covenant, the next major step in redemptive history is the Lord's covenant with Abraham, in which we see a series of repeated promises throughout Genesis chapter 12 to 25. In these chapters, there is a development of the covenant between the Lord and Abraham, originally Abraham, or we say Abraham, it's Abraham or Abram. But anyway, he starts off Abram, or Abraham, and then becomes Abraham, in which it is first initiated in chapter 12, then confirmed by God in an oath in chapter 15, and then years later it is ratified by the sign of circumcision in Genesis chapter 17. Throughout Abraham's life, the Lord repeated several promises that he would have countless descendants or seed. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, and verse 7. Genesis 13, verses 15 to 16. Genesis 15, 18. Genesis 17, 7 and 8 and 10. Genesis 22, verses 12 to 18. And these descendants or seed will inherit a particular land. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 7, chapter 13, verse 15 and 17, Genesis 15, verse 7, and Genesis chapter 17, verse 8, and that many nations and kings would come from him. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, and Genesis 17, verses 4 to 6. The structure of the Abrahamic Covenant. Just as we saw with the Adamic Covenant and the Noahic Covenant, the Abrahamic Covenant has a fivefold structure. In summary, the fivefold structure of the Abrahamic Covenant is as follows. First is the identification of the king, or king redeemer. I am God Almighty, Genesis 17:1. Second is the gospel. That is an accounting of the historical events that led to the establishment of the covenant. Abraham has an exodus from his father's land and is told of the promised land. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Third, the law, that is the stipulations, the terms of the covenant, of which include love, faith, and fidelity, as we read in Genesis 17:1, walk before me and be blameless. Fourth, the penal sanctions, a warning of judgment and penal sanctions against anyone who is not faithful, but a promise to those who maintain fidelity. Genesis 17, verses 9 to 14. But as for an uncircumcised male, one who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And then fifth, the signs, a means of confirming the covenant. In Genesis 17:10 we read, "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised." The call of Abraham. In Genesis 12, we see the sovereign election of Abram, or Abram, who later becomes Abraham. There wasn't a general call to all people to see who would make a covenant with the Lord. The Lord did not send out angels to go from tent to tent to find someone who was willing to believe and obey. Nor did Abraham have an existential crisis, abhor the idols of his father, and set out on a quest to discover the truth about God. The Lord sovereignly chose Abraham, called him out of his idolatrous family, and he immediately responded in faith. The ratification of the Abrahamic Covenant. In Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 to 5, Abraham's name is changed to Abraham. He receives the promise to be a father of a multitude of nations. The Hebrew word for nation is goyim, and the Greek word in the New Testament is ethnos. It is at times translated as Gentile. Abraham also receives the covenant sign of circumcision. I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. I will make my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall you be named Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. In the Abrahamic Covenant, we see 6 promises given to Abraham. First, he will be a father of many nations. Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, Genesis 15:5, and Genesis 17, verses 4 to 5. Second, that he will inherit the land of Canaan. Genesis 12, verse 2, Genesis 15:18, and Genesis 17:8. Third, bless Abraham, and he will be a blessing to the nations. Genesis 12, verse 3. Fourth, curses on those who dishonor Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Fifth, circumcision as a sign of the covenant. Genesis 17:10-14. And sixth, a blessing for Ishmael, for he will be a father of a nation. Genesis 17:20. Everyone in the house of Abraham was circumcised. But did they all receive the promise? The promises of the covenant speak objectively to everyone who receives the sign, but they must be personally received by faith. Not all Israelites were truly children of Abraham. Matthew chapter 3, verse 9. Not all Israel were truly Israel. Romans chapter 9, verse 6. The justification of Abraham. Although Abraham had already believed the Lord and responded in faith to the call in Genesis chapter 12, it is not until Genesis chapter 15 that we read of his faith being accredited to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Genesis chapters 15 and 17 are very important for understanding Paul's epistles, as he makes the case that Abraham was justified before he was circumcised. This is the basis for Paul's argument in Galatians chapter 3, verse 6, and Romans chapter 4, verse 3, as determined by the apostles at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, that the Gentiles did not need to be circumcised before they are justified and a member of the covenant. Romans chapter 4, verses 9-12. Is this blessedness only for the circumcised, or also the uncircumcised? We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe, but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. As we shall see in future lessons, Genesis chapters 15 and 17 are very important texts for our understanding of the inclusion of the Gentiles in the new covenant without circumcision and the doctrine of justification. To read Paul's epistles and not keep these in mind when understanding the doctrine of justification is to interpret the text out of context. So there's a lot more that could be said about the life of Abraham, particularly look at Genesis chapter 22 and his obedience in offering up his son Isaac. But we're primarily focused on those elements of the covenant. Abraham's faith was justified or vindicated in Genesis chapter 22 when he offered up his son Isaac, so that his works were accompanying his faith. He didn't have a said faith like the Pharisees, but he had a genuine faith which was manifested in his believing God that God could raise Isaac from the dead. But we're going to spend more time on that in a future lesson in which we look at the new covenant and the inclusion of the Gentiles. All right, hope you have benefited from this lesson, and until next time, may the Lord richly bless you.